want to finish up the day with what I always considered a treat. We're going to have Emile Haddad say a few words to us. Emile was chair of the Lusk Center Advisory Board. He had a distinguished career at Lennar. He went on to found FivePoint, took it public. The largest, I think it's fair to say, they're the largest master plan communities being developed in California right now. But that's not what he's going to talk about. Emile has this ability to see the future that you would think would be, it's almost like a magic trick, only he really does. And I'm going to give two examples. Is back in February of 2020, when we were just starting to learn about COVID, Emile got up before our board and said, this is going to be really bad. Really, really bad. And people thought that he was maybe being a little extreme. And guess what? It turned out to be really, really bad. And he said, we are not going to come out of this until, this is in 2020, 2022 at the earliest. Okay. Then about a year ago, he gave a talk on Middle East diplomacy, where he talked about how things would start to happen like Iran and Saudi Arabia would start to talk to each other, and Israel and Saudi Arabia would start to, and you're saying, no way, no way. But this is a guy who reads 38 newspapers every morning in 15 different languages. Okay, I'm exaggerating a little bit. Probably. But he actually knows what's going on in the world and is able to communicate it in a very entertaining and prescient way. So I thought it would be a great way to end the program. Emile, thanks for being here.
Thanks. So let me give you background. Why would a real estate developer talk about the world and global events? And maybe it might be worth it to just at least touch on my upbringing background a little bit, which at least gives you a little bit of a backdrop as to why. So I was born and grew up in Beirut, Lebanon. And interesting, when we talk about cities, I grew up in a city that is probably one of the oldest cities in the world, thousands of years. And when people talk about historic, I used to touch walls that were like 2,000 years old in my own neighborhood. And it's interesting. It's a place that has gone through a lot of events and changes. So grew up there. I was 17. Then the Civil War started, which I lived through for 11 years. And part of why I have today the ability to talk about some of this stuff is because for 11 years, I asked myself why. Why did we go through this? What happened? And I think that the one reason I probably today reflect back on that, because I honestly have some concerns today and see some similar shades of things that I started seeing before things got out of control in my old country. The other thing that's interesting is I grew up in a multi-generation home, and my grandmother lived under the Ottoman Empire. My parents lived under the British mandate, and I grew up under the independent state of Lebanon. 3 different eras in history that I had to learn about, and all in my home, learning about how the world has shifted. And today, as I tell people all the time, what people don't really realize is how much of what we're seeing today is the aftermath, believe it or not, of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and World War I and World War II. And I'm going to get to touch on that a little bit. I'm not here to give you a history lesson. That's not the intent. I'm just going to give you a little bit of my view of what's happening in the world today. And the third fact is I grew up also with parents where, as I said, I lived in Beirut. I went to the American University over there. And my mother was the only female I know who was the manager of First National Bank of Boston in Lebanon. So she was a banker, and as a result, I had a lot of understanding of the US way before I moved to this country. And then my dad was an executive in a Dutch company with an office in Amsterdam in the Netherlands for 25 years, and I spent a lot of my time in Europe during the Iron Curtain days. So that, I think, gave me a little bit of a background growing up, and I was always curious. So what does that mean, and where are we today, and why am I even talking to you about this? I think it was Vladimir Lenin that said, sometimes there are decades when nothing happens, and sometimes in weeks, decades happen. And I think that events in the world that happen at moments in time pivot the future and take us into a different direction, and we don't realize it until later on. Obviously, the end of Cold War is an obvious one. 1979 is another year, which I don't need to get into it, but if you're interested, I can tell you 1979 had a major impact on how the world evolved after that. And I can tell you from my perspective, 2015 was another one. And nobody talks about 2015 because nobody actually is connecting dots. So I'm going to take you to the Ukraine because I'm going to just really quickly go through where I see the tectonic shifts globally right now and what I think personally is going to happen and why this third transition in human history, driven by the digital revolution, is going to change a lot in 20, 30, 40 years where the regional centers of power are going to be, economic power as well as power. We saw that happen in the turn of the 20th century with the Industrial Revolution, and we're going to see it now. We're starting to see it now. And we as a country here have to be cognizant about it, and as much as I think it is important to keep on focusing on the micro issues and interest rates, I think we are in this country missing the macro issue, personally. So I came to this country in 1986 after 11 years of war. We had to leave everything behind, started over here from scratch, got into real estate, and as Richard said, I was fortunate enough to get into a position with Lennar Corporation. I was their chief investment officer after I participated in selling them a company here in California. I've been in California my whole career here. And then I decided in 2009 to find a company. And the reason I did that is because as I was with Lennar, I ended up incubating a business that was an off-balance sheet business that was driven by something that nobody else in real estate was really doing, which is thinking 30 years ahead. I think somebody said people in real estate look 7 years and they flip in 5 sometimes and all that. My developments are developed anywhere between 20, 25 years and 40 years. In 1998, when I started on our project in San Francisco, I told people my customer has not been born yet. And in 2023, I'm telling you my customer has not been born yet. So what does that mean? It means interest rates and things like that don't really matter to my strategy. It might be tactical, but I need to understand demographic shifts. And I need to understand geopolitical movements, and I need to understand how technology is going to influence people's thinking. And in the mid-90s, I came to a conclusion that all of that was happening at that time. We were starting to see the first generation that was pushing back on a commute for 2.5 hours to go in pursuit of the white picket fence. Those were the first generation of dot-coms. We started seeing movements here that started pushing back on development. And if you look at what you were showing us in terms of when actually you started seeing the slowdown in California's housing, it really came after CEQA became implemented. And I am pro-CEQA, by the way, but I'm anti-finding loopholes in CEQA to slow projects. The other thing that I think drove me to decide to do what I did was the end of communism in China. At that time, I went to Lennar and said, look, with the end of communism in China, there's going to be major bridges built between the US and Asia. And we need to position ourselves for that, and we need to take control over the major gateways to Asia, and that was San Francisco, LA, and Orange County. And that's really what we did. The problem is you couldn't find a lot of deals at that time that were large enough to build the large master plan communities and start developing in a way that I believe people wanted to live, to your point, with amenities and other things. So guess what? 1992, Congress had made a decision to shut down a lot of Navy bases after the Cold War to reduce budget. And we put ourselves in a position to be the go-to company group to buy and develop and privatize Navy bases. So that's how we got to control a lot of the markets. In San Francisco, we ended up getting a Navy base called Hunters Point. Then I did the deal with the 49ers in the city where we got Candlestick Park, combined it into one project, 12,000 homes, 6 million square feet of commercial on the water in San Francisco between the airport and San Francisco, downtown. In Orange County, we bought the El Toro Marine Base in Irvine. It became the donut hole for the Irvine Ranch. And now it's all under development. And in LA, there was no Navy base, so we took a company private called New Holland and Farming. That's my background. But it was all driven by my view of where the world is heading in terms of democratic and technology. So what does that mean? So I'm going to put only one thing. I don't have slides. I just decided today to give you this because I think, as with every time in history so far, Europe is the epicenter of a lot of the changes. Europe has two issues right now. And I'm going to start with the number one. I'm going to get to Ukraine and what it means, because I think that, unfortunately, we are now listening to all sensational news, and nobody's actually telling us exactly why things are happening, what's happening over there. The first problem that Europe has is linked to Africa. Europe has a demographic issue in terms of shrinkage of demographics over there. Africa is doubling its population over the coming 25 years. Africa's growth is 1.2 billion people. That's the size of China in 25 years. And it's all spilling into Europe. You see the stories every day, boats, sinking and people that are happening, and those are sad stories. But behind that, there's a real story. Europe needs immigration from Africa. Without it, Germany will not be an industrial country in 20 years. But here's the problem. That need and that open borders is giving rise to right-wing movements, evidenced by the fact that we have now a first government of fascism in Italy since World War II. And we all see what happens in France, in Sweden, they're burning the Bible, and etc. That's going to give rise to movements that are very similar to what we saw in the 20th century, and I think Europe is in for a big challenge in terms of that, and that's going to become a bigger problem. Ukraine. Why Ukraine? So this is Russia, and Russia, all through its history, has fought about 20 wars to make sure that they get access to the Black Sea. Because without the Black Sea, Russia has no access to warm water, and most of the transportation in Russia is all rivers, and it's all frozen up here. So this is extremely important for Russia. In 2015, we go back to 2015, there was a discovery of a major area of natural gas in the Mediterranean. And that triggered something called the 3C Initiative. The 3C Initiative is an initiative that basically ties the Black Sea, the Baltics, and the Adriatic. And it basically is an initiative that was put together by 12 nations from the EU. Today they're 13 because guess what? Ukraine has been now admitted, supported by the US and supported by Germany. And the 3C Initiative basically takes infrastructure this way. Now, Europe's infrastructure all through history goes this way. That's why Western Europe is totally dependent on Russia for oil and natural gas. When the discovery of natural gas happened in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, and with oil-producing countries in the Middle East, the 3C Initiative started actually building an alternative to dependency on Russia. You couple that with the creep of the NATO more and more in this area, and you see where Ukraine is, you see where Georgia is. This is the Sea of Azov, which is where fronts Russia. This is the Black Sea, and from here, actually, there's actually another sea in Turkey. Now, the Black Sea is an important thing not only because of Russia, but Black Sea is under a treaty called the Montreux Treaty, which goes back to 1937. The Montreux Treaty says something very simple. If you have access to the Black Sea, meaning if you front on the Black Sea, you have an ability to move military vessels back and forth to the Mediterranean freely. But if you don't, you can't. And that's why Russia has always felt comfortable, because they're the only country that can actually move back and forth. Ships cannot go this way. When Ukraine ended up making noise about becoming NATO, this became a problem. And when we started building this, we basically signaled to Russia that we're basically landlocking you. If I were to predict the end of the Ukraine war, and it's going to be many years from now, in my opinion, the Red is going to be covering all this area. Russia's not going to stop until it controls the whole frontage of the Black Sea, so they can actually make sure that nobody here that is friendly or hostile to Russia is going to be able to access back and forth. The other thing that happened, which is a trigger for all of this, is in Turkey, which, we don't have Turkey on the map. I should have had it. The access to the Black Sea goes through a small sea called Marmara, and that goes through the Bosphorus Strait. The Bosphorus Strait is all under the same treaty. Turkey decided to start digging a canal, and it started digging it last year. That's 30 kilometers east of the Bosphorus Canal, Strait, and it's going to connect the sea from here, the Mediterranean Adriatic, into the Black Sea directly. And Turkey is taking a position that when that canal is open, it is not subject to the same treaty, which means once that canal is done, then everybody can go back and forth to here, which puts Turkey in a very interesting position because it has a foot in the west and a foot in the east. So what does that all mean? I personally think Europe is in for a lot of challenges. And I think we're going to see it unfold, as I said, in terms of more movements that are going to push back, and the Ukraine situation is going to create more challenges for a lot of European countries. But out of every situation like that, there's an area that actually benefits. And the beneficiary of all of this is the Middle Eastern countries right now, because they now have become the alternative to Russia for oil and natural gas. And that is why, for people who read and are interested in that part of the world, that is why today you find the Arabs and the Israelis coming together. Everybody looks at the world as if, static. It's not. Make no mistake. Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Arab countries are strategic partners right now, because they need stability in the Mediterranean and the oil-producing countries, because they know they're going to be producing everything that goes here. And that is what's happening, and mark my words, you're going to hear soon in relative terms. As I said last year, Iran and Saudi Arabia will come together. Everybody thought I was crazy, and now they have. I think that Saudi Arabia and Israel will announce also an alliance. I think for people who follow what's happening in Saudi Arabia, which I'll touch on in a second, you cannot do what Saudi Arabia is doing in terms of the Red Sea development without knowing that you're going to have peace with Israel. And I think this is the region, and I know if you would have asked me that 5 years ago, I would have said no, because I was very negative on that region. I left it very bitter. But I tell you today, the world is shifting, and I think that's the region that's going to actually become a new economic region. Saudi Arabia, I'm spending a lot of time now over there. I have a company over there. And I decided to step down after I took the company public in 2017. And about a year and a half ago, I decided to step down as the CEO of a public company because I started getting frustrated with being able to do business in that world. And as a result, I am now getting much more involved overseas and have a company over there. But what's happening in Saudi Arabia is very interesting because it is actually huge social reform. I keep on telling them it's the biggest secret in the world. It's amazing what's going on in terms of social reform. But they're doing it because they know that they need to start thinking about life after oil. If you read about these projects, and some of them look very awkward. I mean, if you've seen the linear city in Neom and all that, they look like this is like a science fiction movie. But don't look at the project, because the project might or might not change, or some of it might be the same. Look at the driver behind the project. Look at the country that's now starting to think about the days after oil. And so that, I think, in my opinion, is going to be a region that's going to be really flourishing. Now, that has an impact on capital, because a lot of the capital that was coming from that part of the world was going to real estate in the United States and London, different places. And now capital is going back to develop its own area. So you're going to see an impact on capital coming from the Middle East. I'm going to quickly just touch on Africa. Africa is going to be either the biggest problem that the world is going to have 30, 40 years from now, or it's going to be the biggest opportunity. It all depends on how we handle Africa. Africa has a huge issue. It's a fragmented country. It's very tribal. And the fight in Africa is all going to be about water. And how do you feed 1.2 billion new people? But if I'm a betting man, I would say what's happening in the Middle East right now and the coming together of Israel and the Arab countries is going to be helping Africa, because a lot of these countries are African. And I know a lot of people try to go to Africa like China, but you parachute in and you make investments. It's different than if you have a natural geographic connection to where you start expanding into Africa. And I think Africa, I'm more optimistic on Africa. That's why I said yesterday down here, I think Nigeria might be one of those beneficiaries of all of that. So we'll see what happens over there. Real quickly, South America is a mess. And I'll sum it this way. South America's boom was because the Chinese money went to South America. And I always tell people, my friends who are Argentinians, China brought their money and ideology. They pulled their money out and left their ideology behind. And today, if you see the inflation rates over there, it's all driven by the amount of money that came in and created all type of issues with pricing. And if you look at Chile, which is a country that we would have never thought would start thinking about going socialist, they almost became socialist not a long time ago, and I think they're heading in that direction. So South America, I think, as a region, has a lot, and the same thing with Australia, because Australia's boom was happening a lot because of Chinese money. And Xi now has decided to take all the money back to China, suck it back in because he needs it internally, and that leaves us with China, East Asia. Look, East Asia is all about China. And I was with the previous governor in China several years ago on a delegation trip, and I got kicked under the table because I was asked, what did I think? And I guess you live my life, you say what you think. And I said, look, you took off your military suits, you put Brianis on and said, this is a different country. Same people running the same country, which means that China's future is all going to depend on what happens to the central government. And I don't need to get into it because I'm not an expert on China, but I can tell you what was very interesting for me on that trip is to watch the dynamic of the governors of the different provinces, 2 minutes. Different governance of the different provinces sitting, and you felt like you're in the EU, where they're all coming together because the central government is putting together, but they have a lot of misalignment of interest between them. So we'll see what happens over there. I don't know what happens with Taiwan, and that actually going to be a mystery. So US, I'll wrap with that. I think we have the best fundamentals anywhere in the world. Demographics, independency of energy, we have a legal system. We have everything going for us. Except I think this country, and I can tell you, there's nobody this country took me in, and I care so much about it. And today I'm very concerned about it. Because we have now become our worst enemy. We're going through issues that are similar to adolescence in nature. We're bickering over things where actually, I see countries that I left that were absolute desert. I played professional soccer in my life before. I went and played 1980 in Qatar. It was total desert. And you watch World Cup. You go to Dubai. It was built in 25 years. You know how long it took me to put my first shovel in the ground in Valencia here in Newhall? 20 years. 20 years after I got approved of litigation. Dubai was built in 25 years. Housing crisis. Why do we have a housing crisis? And I'll end you. Because we are not thinking about policymaking anymore. We're thinking about election 2 years apart. We're not, they're thinking 30 years forward, and we're thinking 2 years, and I don't want to make a decision so it doesn't come back and backfire on me. I was asked by the governor, and it was interesting, there was a comment made about downtown LA. And I told the story last night. I used to come to the States way before I moved here because my younger brother decided to leave when the war started. And I remember coming here in the 70s. I was like 18, 19, and I said to him, okay, let's go downtown. We're going to go party. Because, you know, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, that's where I spend my time. He's like, we're not going there. I said, why? You have something? He says, no, I don't have anything. I don't want to get killed. We're not going to walk downtown LA at night. You know what I was asked by the governor? He says, give me one low-hanging fruit you would think about to solve the housing issue in California. And I said, I'm going to give you two. One, do away with hard zoning. Hard zoning doesn't have a place today. It existed when the automobile drove everything. When people didn't want to live in cities, we hard zoned them to prevent commingling of places where we shop, places where we work, and places where we live. But that's what people want today. Do away with hard zoning, let the market decide what it is, make it all one mixed use, which I did at the Great Park. I changed everything to one mixed use, and it worked. And the second thing you need to think about, don't think about the building industry the same way. The building industry has changed a lot since I got involved in it. It is dominated today by the mega builders who are trying to meet the quarterly results that they're expected to meet. And California is not the place for them because they can't produce volume over here. They much rather go to Houston, they much rather go to Florida, Arizona, Nevada, anywhere, because it's all about that. And I remember when I came to this country, out of the 10 top builders in California, 9 of them were California-based, and they're private. It doesn't exist anymore. So the only way we're going to build housing is public-private partnerships. The state has to think of itself as a partner. They have to find, similar to what's happening everywhere in the world. Establish an entity that you have an interest in as a partner. Go to CalPERS, go to CalSTRS. This is money that comes from teachers that work here and public employees here. Why invest make them reallocate investment here. And if you do public-private partnership, if you allow the market to decide what to build rather than hard zoning, which you cannot change and end up in lawsuits for 20 years over, we can solve housing. We have to do it how the rest of the world is doing it, because I can tell you, if we don't, we're going to be talking about housing shortage and crime and homelessness for decades to come. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.